This was a horrific crime. To be able to do that to someone would require some level of anger and hatred towards this individual.
It's more easy to assume that a man is probably perhaps more capable of committing this kind of savagery. And so talk with the female who may be an unwitting ride along and see if she might crack.
Keep walking, stop.
What happened in the house? It was covered.
She describes him as being homicidal, and she describes herself as just basically being gripped with fear as this is all unfolding.
I don't get scared much, but looking at these eyes scared.
She claims she becomes kind of a victim in this thing. He did the exact same thing. He started to point more toward her as being the problem. He said she's the one that wanted to murder. She was the mastermind.
If you make the comment of taking her out, I was still kind of like panic mode, and we're trying not to panic.
Both people are clearly involved, but you know, how much of what he says is the truth, how much of what she says is the truth.
I love you, babe. Love you too.
It was a toxic combination that was fueled by sex and power and a desire to live a freestyle life at the expense of another human being.
Why? Why was someone so mad at her? She loved her.
On the evening of January 4th, 2022, police in Tulsa, Oklahoma receive a call from a worried employee at a towing company after 29-year-old Sarah Maguire misses her shift.
She was very reliable in showing up. She had consistent shifts that she was working, and so when her supervisor realized that she's not here today, that obviously set off alarm bells.
She's calling and asking the police department, hey, can you do a welfare check? And this is just not like her. So the police are called out.
They were looking through windows, trying to see if they could see anyone. They were able to see kind of through a hole in the blinds. There was someone on the couch. They were covered up with a blanket.
Obviously, at that point, it's like, yeah, we need to get in there. Something maybe amiss here. Maybe she's ill. Maybe she's sick.
They noticed that the front door is locked.
And so law enforcement breach the window and get through and unlock the door.
When the police department make it inside the home, they go into the room where they've seen what they believe is a person laying there on the couch. Almost the entire portion of that person's body is covered by a blanket. That blanket towards the head has blood on it. When they remove that blanket, they see this woman with gash marks and blood all over her face. Blood matted in her hair. The injuries were quite severe.
It was quite obvious in this scene that she was dead. When we're dealing with a body, even if we know who's supposed to be living there, we just don't make the assumption that the victim is then that person, especially in this case where severe damage was done to the face and everything. So we'll use secondary, and that could be anything from scars, marks, tattoos. In this case, there was some very distinguishable tattoos.
Police took some photographs of some of her tattoos and were able to find out family members' information, contact information. They were able to confirm that that was Sarah Maguire. This was a horrific crime. To be able to do that to someone would require some level of anger and hatred towards this individual. Why did Sarah have to die?
Sarah Elizabeth Maguire grew up in the small town of Apache, Oklahoma.
We grew up a farm family, my mom, my dad, and there were 4 of us kids. I was the oldest. My sister Lindsay was next, and then my sister Sarah, and then our little brother Seth. My parents worked a lot, so we grew up a tight-knit group of siblings. My parents got divorced whenever I was 15, so Sarah would have been 10 and a half, 11. And my dad ended up remarrying 2 years later.
In 2007, 3 years after her father remarried, Sarah decided she needed a change.
Sarah moved to Tulsa in her sophomore year of high school. My mom, Kim, and my sister Lindsay already lived in Tulsa. Sarah had still been living with my dad and stepmother. She decided she wanted to move with our mom, so we moved her up there. It was a really good transition for her.
After high school, Sarah struggled to choose her next steps, but she eventually landed a job where she was thriving.
She was working for Speedy's Towing in Tulsa, Catoosa area, and she was the office manager there. Sarah was the central hub of that workplace. Sarah had such a all-encompassing love and protective nature for people, family, friends. She was one of those people that could be friends with anybody.
We met at a mutual friend's house, and then we just started hanging out, like, all the time. She was really bubbly, funny, charismatic. She would do anything for anyone. If she saw somebody that wanted money, she would give them the last dollar that she had to make sure that they had something.
At this point in her life, she was doing so well. She had a full-time job. She was flourishing.
She was doing great. She was super excited about the things that she was pursuing in life and where she was going. And we were all proud of that.
A lot of the murders here in Tulsa are shootings, some stabbings. This was way more than that.
It was obvious that the cause of death was some type of blunt trauma injury to her head. There's blood spatter on the walls, on the ceiling.
They can see on the blanket that there's a fairly sizable pool of blood, at least on the blanket itself. Underneath the couch, kind of on the floor, there's an even larger pool of blood. There were no signs of forced entry. The front door had been locked. There was some food left on the counter, some pork chops that a couple had been eaten off of. There was some mac and cheese. The circumstances of the home suggested whoever did this had some kind of connection to Sarah. They knew her in some way.
This isn't a scene where somebody came in there who was a stranger to Sarah. You have some sense that whoever was in that house had permission to be in the house and took some care to secure the house when they left. You know, it didn't look like any signs of a struggle. It looked like just an ambush. Why would she be killed in such a manner? The next logical questions, where's her wallet or her purse? Where are her credit cards? You know, is anything here that should be here?
She didn't have her wallet there. Even her phone was gone. No credit cards.
Based on the severity of the violence, detectives know the motive isn't as simple as a robbery gone wrong.
When you look at her injuries, clearly this was fueled by some emotion and some anger or jealousy towards Sarah.
There's no doubt it's personal. There is passion, there is hate, there is aggression.
As detectives continue processing the scene, they collect a crucial piece of evidence.
You have this wrecking bar sitting neatly right on top of a dresser, just conspicuously laying there. Obviously looks like it's been cleaned up or washed up.
To have the crowbar sitting there, right there in the room, just really a couple feet away from Sarah, on seeing those injuries to her face, I think it's a very reasonable and logical conclusion to make that this is more than likely the weapon that was used.
While forensic investigators document the scene, detectives take their search outside the home.
We will canvass the area to see if anybody saw anything unusual, any kind of cars in the neighborhood or anything like that.
Nothing really stood out to any neighbors that would lead them to think that something this horrific had happened just a couple houses away. And speaking with neighbors, officers had learned that Sarah had a white Dodge Charger.
She drives this 2012 white Charger, and it's not where she parks. Let's get the tag. Let's get a good description on that Charger. And then let's be on the lookout as a possibly stolen car, so that if you're in law enforcement and you run across this type of car with an Oklahoma tag, we're looking for it.
And so, do we have someone associated with this killing on the run? Time is of the essence.
Coming up, Sarah's family alerts police to a troubling relationship in her past.
It became more and more toxic. It was a really bad situation.
And investigators track down Sarah's stolen car.
He actually saw the Charger sitting in the parking lot.
They see there's two people sleeping in it, a male and a female.
Hours into the murder investigation of 29-year-old Sarah Maguire, Tulsa police are desperate for any clues into who might have beaten her to death inside her own home.
So the logical step, obviously, is you got to reach out to family, give them a death notification, and then have a very hard conversation with them right at the exact same time.
That personal contact is one of the first places we're always going to look. Who does she associate with? Who has she had problems with?
My mom called me. She lives in Bartlesville, and she was wailing like nothing I've ever heard before. She said, "There's cops at my house, Tulsa cops." She said, something happened to Sarah. And she just said, "Sarah's dead." I just felt like my whole world stopped. I never, in my wildest dreams, imagined that anything like this could have ever happened to Sarah.
This family was in shock. They wanted justice for their sister, their daughter.
Tulsa police, as they're speaking with Sarah's family, trying to figure out who she knows, who might have been in her home, they learn Sarah had been in an on and off again relationship with a man named Walter Spradlin.
Sarah began dating Walter, I would say probably 6 years ago. They started off seeming to be a very good relationship. As the relationship progressed, it became more and more toxic, and I know drugs were involved. And Sarah, this is where her loving nature became a flaw. Our family told her that several times, that you can't fix everybody. You can't fix him, and you can't make this right. You have to take care of yourself. And she didn't see it like that. Sarah and Walter had broken up officially. I believe maybe a year and a half they had been apart.
That would be definitely something we'd want to go and check and talk to Walter.
So they go out and find him and talk with him.
They let him know what had happened to Sarah. I think from his reaction, he was pretty surprised to hear the news.
When we do an investigation like this and we go and we talk to an ex-boyfriend, we want them to tell us where they were, what they were doing, what kind of relationship they had with the person.
He told those officers, "I haven't been with her. I've been home with my family."
Walter denied having any involvement with this case and said that he was home with his mother at the time.
Detectives immediately follow up with Walter's mother to verify his alibi.
His mother confirmed that he had been at the home with her all night and hadn't left. Other family was able to confirm that, and ultimately he was ruled out as a suspect.
After eliminating Walter, detectives reach back out to Sarah's family about her missing credit cards.
Detectives asked her family, "Can you try and contact the bank and see if you can figure out if any of her information has been used to try to purchase anything?"
My mom and Sarah had a joint account. In case Sarah ever needed money, my mom would just put money into that account. And somebody was trying to use Sarah's debit card.
The family eagerly tells detectives that Sarah's card is still in use and moving quickly.
They clearly spotted a trail moving through Oklahoma, up into Missouri a little bit, and then back into Arkansas. They had stopped in a Walmart and took money from the ATM card, did Cash App purchases, did several things.
And that's a huge lead to the case because it gives you a location and a timeline. It's literally like little breadcrumbs left along a path.
As detectives review the activity, they're notified of a new charge from a few minutes earlier.
The last purchase they made was online food order at Whataburger in Fayetteville, Arkansas. So we contacted the Fayetteville Police Department.
They say, hey, we have a homicide that took place in Tulsa. We're looking for a 2012 white Charger.
So they asked some of our patrol officers just to kind of go to the area and see if maybe they couldn't locate the vehicle.
At around 11 a.m., Fayetteville police arrive on the scene of the Whataburger restaurant.
The first officer that got there was one of our motor officers who rides a motorcycle. And so as he pulled in to the area, he actually saw the Charger sitting in the parking lot.
It's still sitting in the parking lot, so now they know, all right, we better get on this. So then the Fayetteville Police Department brings more officers to that location and surround the car.
You're totally surrounded and there's nowhere to go.
It's been less than 24 hours since Sarah Maguire was found brutally murdered. And police have located her stolen car in Fayetteville, Arkansas, more than 100 miles away.
What Fayetteville knows right now is that this is a vehicle that's stolen. It's associated with a homicide, so the Fayetteville Police Department is going to take every precaution.
So once they had a really good plan in place, they started approaching the vehicle.
As they're approaching that vehicle, they see there's two people sleeping in it, a male and a female.
Occupants of the white Dodge Charger in the Whataburger parking lot. Sit up, put your hands up. Let me see your hands. You're totally surrounded and there's nowhere to go. Stand up, face away from me.
Put your hands on top of your head, interlace your fingers, and don't look towards me.
Back seat passenger, exit the vehicle, stand up and face away.
Patrol officers called them out of the vehicle. They pretty much just followed every command that they were given and just got out of the car.
Keep walking, keep walking, keep walking, stop.
Once officers are able to extract these individuals from the car, they're trying to find out identifying information. They ask them, what are your names? And they voluntarily offer to them. One of the individuals is Nicholas Johnson, and then the other is Brinley Denison.
In a case like this where they find the suspects in the victim's vehicle, which has been identified as being stolen, they have enough probable cause to make an arrest.
I love you, babe. Love you too.
So Fayetteville Police Department take them to their police station.
After they were taken into custody, we essentially treated the vehicle like a crime scene. It was secured and towed to a secure lot here at our police department. We contacted Tulsa, let them know that they were under arrest. They told us that they had two detectives that were already on the way.
So Tulsa Police Department, TPD, gets over to Fayetteville to find out what, if anything, they know about the death of Sarah.
They decide to interview Brinley Denison first. Maybe they thought, hey, let's rule her out as maybe a possible victim in this scenario.
It's more easy to assume that a man is perhaps more capable of committing this kind of savagery. And so talk with the female who may be an unwitting ride along and see if she might crack.
We're homicide investigators, and we're here to talk to you about the car you guys were in.
She starts talking about, I knew Sarah, she's a friend of mine.
How did you guys meet?
We're my friends. Walter, he's my best friend.
Brinley explains that she and Sarah shared a mutual connection through Sarah's ex-boyfriend, Walter Spradlin.
It was learned that Walter introduced Brinley to Sarah.
Brinley was looking for a place to stay at that time, and Sarah offered up a place for her to stay. She offered up a shed that was in her backyard.
It was fairly small, it almost looked like a work shed.
How long have you been staying over there?
Probably 2 weeks. I don't know, maybe 3. Yeah.
Did you spend a lot of time in the house as well?
Yeah.
So she treated you right. She was good to you.
Yeah.
So a big question is, why did something like this happen?
To determine exactly what happened to Sarah and why, detectives switch gears and ask Brinley about her connection to Nick.
So how do you know Nick?
I've known him for like a while.
When you say for a while?
Like years and years.
Brinley tells detectives that she's lived in Tulsa her entire life.
Brinley was born in Tulsa, 1996. Childhood was pretty normal. Mom, dad, sister. When me and her mom got a divorce, I think it had a big effect on her. She's 13, 14, and I'm at work. You know, she kind of is able to run wild. And then she gets pregnant in her senior year, drops out of school.
After her son was born, Brinley obtained her GED and went to beauty school.
She did graduate from the beauty school. She could have had a career in hair, but Brinley was, hanging out with the wrong people. And it just went downhill from there.
She was a heavy partier and all that. She had been in trouble with the law on several other occasions. She had a drug past.
Brinley was not working unless you want to say stealing from people is working. It was almost like a high for her. So Brinley was in jail for theft, and we get her out. She comes to my house. But the first night that I worked, she left, and we never saw her again.
She was in between homes, didn't really have anywhere else to go. So Sarah offered Brinley a place to live. Brinley had told detectives in her interview that, she had been in this on-again, off-again relationship with Nicholas Johnson.
Brinley surprises detectives when she explains that Nick is married with children.
Nicholas kind of has a similar storyline to tell about, growing up in kind of a fractured home.
He was born here in Tulsa. Nick grew up staying with his dad, but they would bounce around from wherever they could have a place to stay.
In July 2012, a 19-year-old Nick met his future wife, Stacy, while helping family members move into a new home.
I had rented this out to them, and that is how I met Nick. From day one, we've been inseparable. Several months later, we got married, and I ended up getting pregnant on our first kid. Now we have 5 girls and 1 boy.
When Nick met Brinley in 2019, however, he soon began staying away from home more often.
He had a drug problem, and he was doing, good with it. But I thought that maybe we got back into it.
He was very similar to Brinley in that he was involved in drugs, couldn't hold a job, was doing some kind of like part-time house remodeling.
After collecting details about their suspects, detectives ask Brinley about the last time she saw Sarah Maguire. But she suddenly becomes uncooperative.
And how did you guys get the car?
Yeah, I'm a little worried about it.
She initially plays stupid, I don't know what you're talking about.
Ultimately, as they continued to press her and ask her questions about what happened, she gave them her version or her story of events.
This is important. We didn't come all the way from Tulsa to talk to you about a stolen car, and you probably know that.
I already know.
Okay. What happened in the house? Just tell me why. Who got so mad at her? Why was someone so mad at her?
Brinley starts describing this story, and I certainly would call it a story because it's from her perspective to protect her skin.
25-year-old Brinley Denison has started opening up to authorities about her complicated relationship with murder victim, 29-year-old Sarah Maguire.
Brinley had been living there for, I think, a couple of weeks or so, and they had begun to engage in a romantic relationship.
She'd always say, is she ain't gay? I'm like, I ain't gay either, We're both good guys or whatever. And she was just different. She was all I wanted. Everybody knew that. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows it.
But Brinley had also been in an on-again, off-again relationship with Nicholas Johnson. And kind of where her relationship with Sarah began versus where that relationship with Nicholas ended is a bit murky.
Last time we talked, I broke up with him. There was a huge photo.
And he knew you were staying over with Sarah?
Yeah.
So the night of the murder, Brinley tells Tulsa police detectives that she and Sarah were hanging out in that main house area. Sarah had cooked her dinner, and then Nicholas Johnson shows up.
I didn't know he was coming.
Nicholas was in love with Brinley. He was going there to hopefully make up with Brinley.
Who invited him in the house?
Sarah did.
So when he came in, was it friendly?
Yeah.
Was it friendly for a while?
Yeah.
So where did it go from?
When did it go?
Where did it go bad?
The pictures.
Brinley says Nicholas had seen some photographs of Brinley and Sarah, maybe some scantily clad photographs that really upset him.
Were the pictures sexual in nature?
Yeah.
How did the pictures get seen?
They were in the room, and he went back there.
And so he saw these pictures, and did he think that that was a problem between you and him?
Yeah, he knows.
Was he pissed at you or pissed at her?
Both. I don't get scared much, but when I scared to
She describes him as being homicidal, in that he's in such a rage that he's going to kill Sarah. And so she flees to this back bedroom of Sarah's house, and she can just hear the homicide taking place, and she describes herself as just being gripped with fear as this is all unfolding.
less than 10 seconds, but it felt like forever.
She getting hit with?
A crowbar.
Sarah was laying on her couch. It doesn't give me any indication that she may have even been conscious at the time the first blow was delivered to her.
Brinley tells detectives the night's horrors were far from over.
So did you guys leave right then and there? Or did you...
No. He forced himself on me first.
She claimed after he beat her, he then grabbed Brinley and took her into the bedroom and raped her. So now she becomes kind of a victim in this thing.
Brinley told detectives that the plan was that they would travel to Arkansas, to Devil's Den. And along the way, they needed to dump the clothes, get rid of some of this physical evidence that might be tying them to the murder. During this whole time, Brinley is telling detectives she was in fear for her life, and she was essentially hostage with Nicholas as he was doing all of these things. All of this behavior that happened while they're on the road, the multiple stops that were made, being left alone in the vehicle multiple times, that really stood out to detectives as this isn't adding up with your version of events. There were multiple times where, if Brinley wanted to leave, she could have left. So detectives went to go talk to Nicholas Johnson, see what he would tell them.
We know Sarah's dead. You know Sarah's dead. You were there when Sarah died, and you were in Sarah's car.
Well, what happened?
That you killed Sarah.
I didn't kill Sarah.
This is your God-given opportunity that we are here right now to talk to you about why things took place. There's 2 sides, 3 sides to every story, okay?
Surprisingly, he decided he wanted to start talking.
Did she piss you off? Did she say something? Did she steal from you?
No, it was more over love.
Over love over who?
Brinley.
Detectives are speaking with Nicholas Johnson after his ex-girlfriend Brinley Denison implicated him in the murder of Sarah Maguire.
Once Nick breaks down and acknowledges his involvement, Nick describes how it appears to him that the relationship that he had with Brinley was compromised because of his discovery of Brinley having some relationship with Sarah.
Sarah was trying to put a wedge between me and Brinley.
Did that make you jealous?
A little bit.
But contrary to what Brinley is describing about Nick's rage, he doesn't describe it as rage. His focus is he's trying to figure out how to rebuild the relationship with Brinley, a person that he's professing his love for.
He tells them, I went over there to try and talk with Brinley, see if we could work things out.
Her and Brinley were arguing. Having some sort of debate. I don't know what it was. It was like, when I come in, tension was kind of high.
Nicholas tells detectives that he and Brinley stepped outside so she could get some air.
What was decided between you and Brinley?
That she was glad and happy to see me, and that we was going to try to move forward in our relationship.
When the couple came back inside, Nicholas says Sarah was asleep on the couch.
Apparently, what Brinley tells me is she don't like Sarah either. Somehow we got on the topic of stealing her car and all that stuff. We were just going to take off, and then Brinley was make the comment of taking her out.
He and Brinley have this conversation of he's gonna kill Sarah, killing Sarah and stealing her stuff. And so ultimately that's what they decide to do.
Were you angry at Sarah when all this stuff went down because of the love you felt for Brinley?
Yeah, because initially I had felt like the issues that we were having that Sarah had caused it.
Who went and got the weapon?
It was already in the house, there in the kitchen.
So who picked up the crowbar first?
Brinley had it. She came into the living room with it.
Brinley, according to Nick, is the one that actually hands him the wrecking bar and says, do it. If you want the relationship, then Sarah's the problem. Sarah needs to go.
And I was talking to Brinley, and honestly, after that, I really kind of just blacked out on it. Like, you just kind of zoned out on the whole thing.
Nick tells police officers that after he beats Sarah, he and Brinley go to have sex, but this is consensual. And while this is going on, he's still able to hear Sarah in the background, making noises, kind of moving around.
The sick, twisted details of the two of them having sex in the victim's bed, admitting to being able to hear the victim struggling to live. If that doesn't give you chills and make you mad and angry, I don't know what does.
So what did you guys take from the house when you guys left?
I didn't take anything personally. I was still kind of like in panic mode and trying not to panic. And she was going through stuff in the bedroom and putting stuff in the bags that we had, that she had made up, her purse and another bag that had some clothes in it.
How about her credit cards? Do you know where her credit cards are?
Brinley had all those. She was the one that she was more with the brains with the credit cards and stuff like that.
Nicholas did the exact same thing as Brinley. He started to point more towards Brinley as being the problem. She talked him into it. She's the one that wanted to murder Sarah. She's the one that wanted to take the car and the money and all that. She was the mastermind.
So the detectives are now trying to figure out, can we prove one or both of these stories?
Coming up, as prosecutors prepare for trial, evidence continues to mount against both suspects. But will it be enough to convict?
The defense had argued that we didn't have sufficient evidence.
Her case was remanded back to the preliminary hearing stage.
I was very disappointed. The questions started flooding in about why, just why.
Less than 30 hours into the murder investigation of Sarah Maguire, Brinley Denison and Nicholas Johnson have both told Tulsa police their version of what happened in the savage crime.
Brinley's version is she's the held hostage rape victim. Nick's version is she's the mastermind behind the idea of killing Sarah and was a willing participant. Both people are clearly involved, but, you know, how much of what Nick says is the truth, how much of what Brinley says is the truth.
When detectives analyzed the couple's electronic trail following the murder, they discovered that Brinley and Nicholas were caught on camera at one of their many stops.
It's obvious from some of the receipts that we are able to recover that Nick, he's obviously savvy enough from his life on the streets to know that he can take a phone, and did that to a Walmart and was able to sell that phone to acquire some cash.
Tulsa police were able to recover some surveillance footage showing they did stop at a Walmart.
We see that Nick had actually gone into the Walmart by himself to do this transaction. She remained in the car, and that kind of debunked the whole kidnapping. She would have had a chance to run away and flee and everything.
I believe he was in there for about 20 minutes, and in that point in time, she's in a public place. There are a number of individuals who she could have sought help from. She was not this victim that she tried to paint herself out to be.
When authorities dive deeper into Brinley and Nicholas's backgrounds, it only further supports the idea that Brinley was a lot more involved than she was letting on.
Nick's rap sheet doesn't jump out at you as anything remarkable. I mean, I think the most he had was maybe some prior possession of drugs, but you look at Brinley, and it's a rap sheet that just doesn't stop.
There was some, possession of drugs, some theft either of a credit card or unauthorized use of a credit card.
One of the things that stood out was she was involved in a vehicle theft, and it was an armed, vehicle theft. Here's somebody who is claiming that she was a victim, and yet her track record suggests that she's a whole lot more savvy with the criminal justice system than Nick was. She's not a victim in this case.
Brinley claims that she and Sarah were in a relationship, but outside of Brinley's statements, there was really not much that we could say, yes, that's true, or no, that's not. I do not believe any photograph of Brinley and Sarah was ever recovered.
On January 6th, Brinley Denison and Nicholas Johnson are both charged with first-degree murder and extradited to Tulsa, Oklahoma to stand trial.
I was so grateful that they had been found, and then just the questions started flooding in about why, just why.
My reaction to hearing the news of Brinley was shock more than anything. I couldn't believe it. It's definitely not the way she was raised.
Faced with a mountain of evidence, Nicholas Johnson decides to plead guilty to the charges.
Prosecutors were going to file the bill of particulars, which means seeking the death penalty against these two. And Nicholas decides to blind plead, basically meaning I'm going to plead guilty without a deal from prosecution. So the judge is up to him to sentence him to whatever he sees fit.
So he enters a blind plea to the crime of murder in the first degree and a blind plea to the crime of possession of a stolen vehicle.
He did that in May, and by July he was sentenced to life without parole and sent to prison.
The case against Brinley Denison is more complicated.
The defense had argued that based on the evidence, we didn't have sufficient evidence to prove that she was a principal in the death of Sarah. And the court bought off on that argument.
Her case was remanded back to the preliminary hearing stage, and they had a hearing where Nicholas testified. After that, the judge ruled that there wasn't enough evidence to show that she had committed the crime of first-degree murder.
So once first-degree murder is off the table for Brinley, she pleads guilty to accessory to murder and gets sent to prison for 20 years.
As far as Brinley's sentence, I was very disappointed.
I don't think justice was served. Personally, I think that they should have been given the death penalty.
Sarah's never going to be back. Sarah's never going to be able to hug her mom or her family members or sisters. These two had a very sick relationship. And I think independently we wouldn't have seen this, but the two of them acting together was a toxic combination that was fueled by drugs and sex and power.
They conspired to kill her, to steal her belongings, steal her credit cards, steal her phone, and ultimately see, what all can we get away with. I think that Sarah would still be here today if it weren't for the both of them coming together.
Sarah was only 29, and she had so much potential, so much drive that was just taken for no reason whatsoever.
I want people to remember Sarah for how big of a heart that she had. I felt it in my own life and the things she would do for me, and hearing stories from other people of the things she would do and how she would help them. She would always help somebody in need. I mourn the life that she should have had, and I want people to remember how amazing she was.
The story of the Matthew Levison disappearance does not begin with a crime scene or a body, or even a clear moment of violence. It begins instead with absence, with a young man stepping out into the early hours of a Sydney morning and, somehow, never stepping back into the world again, and for years. That absence would become the most unsettling piece of evidence of all, because it left behind a silence that no witness could fill, no forensic test could explain, and no court could definitively resolve. And at the center of that silence was Matthew Levison, just 20 years old, a dancer immersed in the rhythm and energy of Sydney's nightlife. Someone who, by all accounts, lived outwardly rather than inwardly. Someone whose life moved through crowded dance floors, conversations, friendships, fleeting moments of connection that define the kind of social world where people are almost never truly alone. And yet, on the night of September 23rd, 2007, that world did not protect him. It did not preserve him. It did not even leave behind a clear record of what happened in his final known hours. Because sometime between the glow of nightclub lights and the first pale hint of morning, Matthew vanished. And the last confirmed moment of his presence is almost deceptively ordinary. Leaving a nightclub, walking out into the night, accompanied by someone he knew, someone he trusted, someone who would later stand in a courtroom and face accusations that could not be proven beyond reasonable doubt. That person being Michael Atkins, the last known individual to see Matthew alive. And that fact alone would come to define everything that followed. Not because it provided answers, but because it raised questions that no investigation could fully resolve. Questions about what happened behind closed doors. Questions about time that cannot be reconstructed. Questions about truth that exists somewhere beyond the reach of legal certainty. And in the years that followed, this case would evolve into something more than a missing person investigation. It would become a study in the limits of justice itself. Because there are cases where evidence accumulates, where timelines solidify, where narratives become clear enough for a jury to follow from beginning to end. And then there are cases like this one, where the timeline fractures into uncertainty, where the most critical hours are defined not by what is known, but by what is missing. Where the space between 2 a.m. and 7 a.m. becomes less a sequence of events and more a void, a stretch of time that resists reconstruction. And within that void lies the central mystery of Matthew Levison's disappearance. Because the known facts are simple, almost too simple, he went to a nightclub in Sydney. He socialized, he met Michael Atkins, and he left with him, and after that, nothing that can be independently verified. No confirmed sightings, no digital traces, no communications, no signs of movement through the world that he had so actively participated in just hours earlier. And this is where the story begins to shift from a narrative of events to a narrative of absence. Because in modern investigations, people rarely disappear completely. They leave behind footprints. Financial activity, phone records, fragments of presence that can be traced and analyzed. But Matthew left none of these, and that absence is not neutral. It is not simply a lack of data. It is itself a form of evidence, one that suggests interruption, one that suggests that whatever happened did not allow for continuation, and yet, even with that implication, the case resists closure because implication is not proof. And suspicion is not conviction, and in the legal system, those distinctions matter more than anything else. And so from the very beginning, this case carries a tension between what seems likely and what can be demonstrated, between what feels true and what can be proven. And that tension would define every stage of the investigation, every argument in court, every attempt to reconcile the known with the unknowable. And as time passed, the mystery only deepened because there was no immediate resolution, no sudden discovery that clarified what had happened. Instead, there was waiting, searching, questioning, and gradually, the realization that this was not going to be a case that resolved itself quickly, that it was instead becoming something more complicated, something that would challenge not just investigators, but the very framework through which justice is pursued. Because how do you prove a crime without a body? How do you establish a timeline when the most critical hours are unaccounted for? How do you move from suspicion to certainty when the evidence remains just out of reach? And these are not abstract questions. They are the practical realities that shaped the case of Matthew Levison from the very beginning. And they're the reason why, even now, this story does not fit neatly into the structure of a solved crime. Because although years later there would be developments, discoveries that brought some measure of truth to light, those discoveries would come with their own complications, their own trade-offs, their own unresolved consequences, and so the case stands as something paradoxical, something that both reveals and withholds, something that offers answers but not resolution. And it all traces back to that night, to that departure from a nightclub, to that final confirmed moment when Matthew Levison was still part of the visible world, still moving through it, still connected to the people around him, before crossing into a space where visibility ends and uncertainty begins. And it is in that transition, in that movement from presence to absence, that the story truly takes hold. Because what follows is not just an investigation into what happened to one individual, but an exploration of how truth can exist without being provable, how justice can be pursued without being achieved, and how, in some cases, the most haunting question is not who is responsible, but whether responsibility can ever be established in a way that satisfies both the law and the need for closure. And that is where this story begins. To understand the weight of what was lost in the Matthew Levison disappearance, it is necessary to move away from the mystery for a moment and focus instead on the person at its center. Because cases like this risk becoming defined by what cannot be explained, when in reality they begin with a life that was very much present, very much active, and deeply embedded in a social world that does not easily allow someone to simply vanish. And that life belonged to Matthew Levison, a 20-year-old dancer living in Sydney, a city known for its vibrant nightlife and complex social networks, particularly within the LGBTQ+ community, where connection, visibility, and movement between spaces are constant, and Matthew was not on the margins of that world. He was part of its rhythm, part of its energy, someone who worked, socialized, and built relationships within an environment defined by late nights, music, and shared experience. And those who knew him consistently described him in ways that emphasized presence rather than withdrawal. He was outgoing, socially connected, and engaged with the people around him. Not someone who showed signs of retreating from his life or planning to disappear from it. And that distinction is crucial because in many missing person cases there are indicators, subtle or otherwise, that suggest a break from routine, a shift in behavior, a sign of internal struggle. But here, according to the available data, there are no such indicators, no evidence of severe distress, no pattern of isolation, no history of leaving without contact. And that absence of warning signs makes his disappearance more difficult to reconcile, because it removes one of the more common explanations and replaces it with uncertainty, forcing the focus outward rather than inward, toward the circumstances and relationships surrounding his final hours rather than any internal motivation to leave. And within that context, one relationship becomes central, not because it is unusual, but because of its proximity to the moment everything changed. And that relationship was with Michael Atkins, his boyfriend, someone who existed within the same social environment, someone who shared parts of that nightlife world, and someone whose connection to Matthew would later become the focal point of the investigation, not as a matter of speculation alone, but as a matter of fact, because Atkins was the last known person to be with Matthew before he disappeared. And that fact alone reshapes the way their relationship is viewed. Because what might otherwise be understood as a private, complex dynamic between two individuals becomes, in the context of a disappearance, a critical piece of the timeline, a point of entry into the unknown, and yet, the nature of their relationship, as described in the data, resists simplification. It was neither entirely stable nor entirely volatile. Instead, it existed somewhere in between, characterized at times by closeness and at other times by tension, which is not uncommon in relationships, particularly within environments where schedules are irregular, social interactions are constant, and emotional dynamics can shift quickly. But in this case, that variability becomes significant, not because it proves anything in itself, but because it introduces the possibility of conflict, the possibility of moments that are not visible to others, moments that occur behind closed doors and leave no immediate trace. And this is where the narrative begins to tighten. Because when a disappearance occurs in proximity to a relationship that includes elements of tension, even if those elements are not extreme or unusual, they become part of the analytical framework, part of the way investigators attempt to understand what might have happened. And yet it is important to remain grounded in what is actually known, because the data does not describe a relationship defined by violence or extreme instability. It describes one that fluctuates, one that includes both intimacy and disagreement. And that distinction matters because it prevents the narrative from becoming reductive, from turning complexity into assumption, and instead keeps the focus on the intersection between relationship and circumstance, between personal dynamics and the specific events of that night, and beyond the relationship itself. There is also the broader environment in which both individuals existed. The nightlife culture of Sydney, particularly venues like ARQ Nightclub, which serve as social hubs where people gather, interact, and move between different groups over the course of night. Spaces where encounters are frequent and often transient, where conversations begin and end within hours, and where the line between public and private can blur as people leave together, move to other locations, or continue their interactions beyond the visible space of the club. And in such an environment, it is not unusual for two people to leave together. It does not immediately signal anything beyond the continuation of a social interaction. And that normalcy is part of what makes the events of that night so difficult to interpret, because nothing in the initial stages stands out as inherently alarming. Nothing in the available descriptions suggests a clear moment where something shifted from ordinary to dangerous. And that absence of a visible turning point is one of the defining features of this case, because it forces the narrative to rely on reconstruction rather than observation, on inference rather than direct evidence. And it places significant weight on the relationship between Matthew and Atkins, not as a conclusion, but as a focal point, the last known connection before the disappearance, and therefore the starting point for any attempt to understand what followed. And as the story moves forward into the events of that night, this context becomes essential, because without it, the disappearance exists in isolation, but with it, the disappearance becomes part of a network of relationships, environments, and moments that, while individually unremarkable, collectively form the backdrop against which something irreversible occurred. And it is within that backdrop, within that combination of personal connection and social setting, that the case begins to unfold, not with a clear narrative, but with a series of elements that, when placed together, highlight not just what is known, but how much remains uncertain, and how that uncertainty is shaped as much by the life Matthew lived as by the moment he disappeared. The events of the night of September 23rd, 2007, in the Matthew Levison disappearance unfold with a kind of quiet normalcy that, in hindsight, feels almost deceptive, because nothing in the early hours suggests that this will become the final traceable chapter in the life of Matthew Levison. And yet, it is precisely this ordinariness that makes the disappearance so difficult to process, as the timeline begins in a way that mirrors countless other nights in Sydney, with Matthew arriving at ARQ nightclub around 10:00 p.m., stepping into a space defined by music, movement, and social interaction, a place where he was not an outsider but a participant, someone who belonged within that environment. And by all available accounts, his behavior that night aligns with that familiarity. He meets friends, he drinks, he dances. He engages in the kind of fluid, ongoing interaction that defines nightlife culture. And there is no indication at this stage of distress, no report of conflict, no moment that stands out as a precursor to what would follow. In this initial period, though seemingly uneventful, is important because it establishes a baseline, a sense of continuity with his usual patterns, reinforcing the idea that nothing about this night began differently from any other. And as the hours pass and the club remains active, the timeline moves toward a point that will later become critical, sometime around 2:00 a.m., when Matthew encounters Michael Atkins inside the venue, and this meeting, like the earlier part of the night, does not immediately signal anything unusual. Witnesses who observe them describe an interaction that appears normal. There is no clear evidence of a heated argument, no visible escalation that would draw attention. And this absence of visible conflict is significant, because it means that whatever tension may have existed between them, if any, was not outwardly expressed in a way that others could clearly identify at that moment. And so the narrative continues to unfold without interruption, without a defined turning point, as the two men remain within the same space before eventually making the decision to leave together. A decision that, within the context of a nightclub, is entirely unremarkable. People arrive together, leave together, form and reform social connections throughout the night. And nothing about this action alone would have raised concern at the time. But what distinguishes this moment in retrospect is not the act itself, but what follows. Because surveillance confirms that Matthew and Atkins exit the club together, marking the last independently verified sighting of Matthew alive, and from that point forward, the narrative shifts from observation to reconstruction, from what is documented to what is described. And this shift introduces the central uncertainty that defines the case. Because once they leave the club, there are no longer any neutral witnesses, no external records that can confirm their movements, and according to Atkins' account, the two of them return to his apartment, where the interaction continues in private. And it is here that the timeline becomes both more specific and more fragile. Because the details rely entirely on a single source, Atkins states that once inside the apartment, an argument takes place, though the exact nature of that argument is not consistently described. And this inconsistency becomes important later, but at this stage, what matters is that this is the setting in which the final known interaction occurs. A confined space, removed from the public environment of the club, where whatever happened next would leave no immediate witnesses, and according to Atkins, the argument does not escalate into violence. Instead, he claims that Matthew eventually leaves the apartment on his own at approximately 7:00 a.m., walking out into the morning alone. And if this account were complete and verifiable, the timeline would extend beyond the apartment, providing a new set of possibilities for what might have happened afterward. But this is where the structure of the narrative begins to break down. Because there is no independent confirmation of this departure, no witness who saw Matthew leave, no camera footage capturing his exit, no physical or digital trace that places him outside the apartment after that time. And this absence transforms the period between 2:00 a.m. and 7:00 a.m. into what investigators would later recognize as a critical gap, a black hole in the timeline where the most important events are believed to have occurred but cannot be directly observed or verified. And within this gap, the distinction between account and evidence becomes crucial. Because an account, no matter how detailed, cannot substitute for corroboration. And without corroboration, it remains just one version of events among many possible interpretations. And as the morning progresses beyond the time Atkins claims Matthew left, another layer of absence begins to take shape. Because Matthew does not reappear in any form that can be tracked. He does not contact friends. He does not use his phone. He does not access his bank accounts. He does not engage in any of the routine actions that would normally leave behind a record of continued presence. And this complete lack of post-7:00 a.m. activity is not just unusual. It is profoundly inconsistent with his established patterns because someone who is socially active, who is embedded in a network of relationships, who participates regularly in nightlife and communication, does not typically disengage from all forms of contact without explanation. And this is where the timeline, rather than expanding, collapses inward. Because instead of leading to new locations, new interactions, new evidence, it leads to nothing. And that nothing becomes the defining feature of the incident, not as an absence of information alone, but as an active contradiction of what would be expected if Matthew had simply walked away and continued his life elsewhere. And so the night of September 23rd does not end with a clear event. It does not conclude with a discovery or a resolution. Instead, it transitions into a state of uncertainty that extends beyond the immediate timeline, leaving behind a sequence of moments that begin with normalcy, pass through a brief intersection of two lives, and then disappear into a space where the narrative can no longer be directly observed, only inferred. And it is this transition from the visible to the untraceable that defines the incident at the heart of the case, because it marks the point where Matthew Levison's life, as it can be documented and understood, effectively ends, not with a confirmed act, but with a gap that resists closure, a span of hours that remains the focal point of every question that follows, and a sequence of events that, despite its simplicity on the surface, conceals within it a level of uncertainty that no subsequent investigation has been able to fully resolve. The investigation into the Matthew Levison disappearance did not begin with clarity, but with a narrowing of possibilities, because once it became evident that Matthew Levison had not reappeared, had not contacted anyone, and had left behind no trace of continued activity, the focus of investigators in Sydney shifted rapidly from a missing person scenario to something more serious, something that implied interruption rather than voluntary absence. And in cases like this, the early stages of an investigation are often defined by breadth, by the exploration of multiple avenues. But here, the available facts immediately began to constrict that breadth, because the last confirmed sighting of Matthew placed him in the company of a single individual, Michael Atkins, and that fact, while not proof of wrongdoing, established a logical starting point that investigators could not ignore. And so from the outset, Atkins became central to the inquiry, not as a conclusion, but as the most direct link to the missing hours, the only person who could provide a continuous account of what happened between the moment they left ARQ nightclub and the point at which Matthew was said to have left the apartment. And this reliance on a single narrative introduced both opportunity and limitation, because while it allowed investigators to construct a provisional timeline, it also meant that any inconsistencies within that narrative would carry significant weight. And over time, those inconsistencies began to emerge, not necessarily as dramatic contradictions, but as shifts in detail, variations in how events are described, changes in timing, and differences in the characterization of the argument that allegedly took place inside the apartment. And in an investigative context, such variations are not automatically indicative of deception. Memory can be imperfect, especially under stress. But when the timeline in question contains a critical gap, and when there is no independent evidence to support or challenge the account, those variations take on greater significance, because they represent the only available points of analysis, the only elements that can be examined, compared, and tested for internal consistency. And as investigators scrutinized these statements, a pattern of uncertainty began to form, not enough to establish a clear alternative narrative, but enough to prevent full confidence in the one that had been provided. And this created a fundamental tension within the investigation, because suspicion alone is not sufficient to establish a case. It must be supported by evidence that can withstand legal scrutiny, and, at this stage, that evidence was notably absent. There was no confirmed crime scene, no physical traces that indicated violence had occurred, no forensic material that could link an event to a specific location or action, and, perhaps most critically, there was no body. And this absence would come to define the trajectory of the investigation more than any single statement or theory. Because without a body, it becomes significantly more difficult to prove that a crime has taken place at all, let alone to determine the nature of that crime or the identity of the person responsible. And so investigators were faced with a situation in which the circumstantial framework pointed in a particular direction, but the evidentiary foundation required to support that direction was incomplete. And in response to this challenge, they pursued multiple lines of inquiry, one of which involved examining Atkins' behavior following the disappearance, because in many cases, post-event behavior can provide insight into prior actions. And here, certain aspects of that behavior were considered notable, including the fact that Atkins did not report Matthew missing and was not fully cooperative in a way that might have helped clarify the timeline. And while these factors raised concern, they remained within the realm of interpretation. They could suggest awareness, avoidance, or something else entirely. But without corroborating evidence, they could not be definitively linked to a specific act. And so the investigation continued to expand outward, with search efforts conducted across various bushland areas, locations that, due to their size and terrain, present significant challenges for recovery operations. And despite these efforts, no remains were found, no physical confirmation of death, no site that could be identified as the location where events had reached their conclusion. And with each unsuccessful search, the investigation encountered the same barrier: the inability to move from hypothesis to confirmation. And this barrier was not simply practical. It was structural, embedded in the requirements of the legal system, which demands proof that can be presented, examined, and defended in court. And as time passed, the absence of such proof began to shape the investigation in more profound ways, because it limited the options available to investigators. It constrained the types of charges that could be pursued, and it forced a reliance on circumstantial reasoning that, while potentially persuasive, would ultimately need to meet a very high standard to result in a conviction. And within this context, the period between 2:00 a.m. and 7:00 a.m. remained the focal point, the segment of time that investigators returned to repeatedly, attempting to reconstruct it through indirect means, through the analysis of statements, through the examination of known movements before and after, through the identification of inconsistencies that might indicate where the account diverged from reality. And yet, despite these efforts, the core problem persisted. There was no independent verification of what occurred during those hours, no external data that could anchor the narrative in something beyond testimony. And this lack of anchoring meant that every theory remained, to some extent, speculative, grounded in logic but not in demonstrable fact. And as the investigation moved forward, this tension between suspicion and proof became more pronounced, shaping not only the strategies employed by law enforcement, but also the expectations surrounding what the case could ultimately achieve. Because even as investigators developed a working theory of what might have happened, they were simultaneously confronted with the reality that proving that theory in a court of law would require more than inference. It would require evidence that, at least at that stage, did not exist. And so the investigation became a process not only of seeking answers, but of confronting limitations, of navigating the space between what seemed likely and what could be established. And it is within this space that the case of Matthew Levison reveals one of its most defining characteristics: the way in which the absence of a single element, the lack of a body, can reshape an entire investigative process, turning what might otherwise be a straightforward progression into a prolonged and uncertain effort, one in which every step forward is tempered by the recognition that without definitive proof, even the most compelling narrative may remain unresolved. The transition from investigation to courtroom in the Matthew Levison disappearance did not resolve the uncertainties that had defined the case, but instead brought them into sharper focus, because when Michael Atkins stood trial in 2009, the central challenge was no longer simply to understand what might have happened to Matthew Levison, but to prove beyond reasonable doubt that a specific crime had occurred and that Atkins was responsible for it. And this distinction is critical, because the standards of a criminal court are fundamentally different from the working assumptions of an investigation. Suspicion, even strong suspicion, is not enough. It must be supported by evidence that can withstand scrutiny, that can be tested, challenged, and ultimately accepted as proof. And in this case, the prosecution faced a task that was inherently difficult: constructing a narrative of events that could explain Matthew's complete disappearance, while simultaneously compensating for the absence of the very elements that would normally anchor such a narrative. There was no body to confirm death, no forensic evidence to establish a cause, no physical traces within the apartment that could definitively indicate that violence had taken place, and no independent witnesses who could describe what occurred during the critical hours between 2 a.m. and 7:00 a.m. And yet, despite these limitations, the prosecution advanced a theory that sought to bring coherence to the available facts, arguing that Matthew had died inside Atkins' apartment following an argument, and that his body had subsequently been disposed of, a theory that aligned with the circumstantial framework of the case, the last known sighting, the lack of activity afterward, the inconsistencies in Atkins' account. But alignment is not the same as proof, and as the case unfolded in court, each of these elements was subjected to the adversarial process, examined not only for what it suggested, but for what it could actually demonstrate, and the defense, operating within the same evidentiary landscape, focus on the gaps rather than the connections, emphasizing the absence of a body as a fundamental weakness, because without confirmation of death, the prosecution's entire argument rested on inference, and in criminal law, inference must be supported by facts that lead to only one reasonable conclusion. And here, the defense argued that alternative explanations, however unlikely, could not be entirely excluded, that without direct evidence, there remained a possibility that Matthew had left the apartment and that his subsequent disappearance, while unexplained, was not conclusively linked to Atkins, and this line of reasoning, while it did not provide a positive account of what happened, did not need to, because the burden of proof does not lie with the defense, it lies with the prosecution. And the requirement is not to eliminate suspicion, but to eliminate reasonable doubt. And as the trial progressed, the limitations of the case became increasingly apparent. The inconsistencies in Atkins' statements, while notable, could not be definitively tied to a specific act. The lack of forensic evidence meant there was no physical anchor for the prosecution's theory, and the absence of a body left a critical question unresolved, not only how Matthew had died, but whether his death could be legally established at all. And this last point is particularly significant because in many jurisdictions, it is possible to prosecute a homicide without a body, but doing so requires a strong constellation of circumstantial evidence, evidence that collectively points to a single, unavoidable conclusion. And in this case, that constellation was incomplete. The elements were present, but they did not align with sufficient precision to meet the required standard. And so the jury was left with a narrative that was plausible, perhaps even compelling in parts, but not definitive, not conclusive in the way that the law demands. And ultimately, this distinction determined the outcome, because when the verdict was delivered, Atkins was found not guilty, a decision that did not assert his innocence in a broader moral sense, but rather reflected the court's determination that the prosecution had not proven its case beyond reasonable doubt. And this outcome had immediate and lasting consequences, not only for the individuals involved, but for the case itself, because under the principle of double jeopardy, a foundational element of the legal system designed to protect individuals from being tried multiple times for the same offense, Atkins could not be prosecuted again for the same charge based on the same set of facts, unless new and compelling evidence emerged that fundamentally altered the evidentiary landscape. And this principle, while essential for safeguarding against wrongful conviction, also introduces a form of finality that can be difficult to reconcile in cases where uncertainty remains, because it closes one path to resolution while leaving the underlying questions unanswered. And in the context of the Matthew Levison case, this created a paradox that would persist for years. The court had reached a verdict, the legal process had been completed, and yet, the central mystery had not been resolved. The absence that defined the case remained. The lack of a body continued to limit understanding, and the gap between what was suspected and what could be proven remained as wide as ever. And so the conclusion of the trial did not bring closure. It did not provide a clear endpoint. Instead, it marked a transition into a new phase of the case, one in which the legal avenues have been largely exhausted, but the need for answers, particularly from Matthew's family, remained as urgent as before, and it is this dissonance between legal resolution and factual uncertainty that defines the outcome of the trial, not as a definitive answer, but as a reflection of the limits of the system when confronted with a case built on absence rather than presence, on inference rather than proof, and on a series of events that, despite being partially known, could not be reconstructed with the level of certainty required to transform suspicion into conviction. The conclusion of the trial in the Matthew Levison disappearance did not mark an end so much as it marked a suspension, a state in which the legal system had reached its limit while the emotional and factual realities of the case remained unresolved. Because although Michael Atkins had been found not guilty, the absence of Matthew Levison still defined everything that followed. And in the years between 2009 and 2016, that absence settled into something more enduring than uncertainty alone. It became a form of unresolved presence, a constant reminder that the case was not closed in any meaningful sense, that there was no physical site of mourning, no confirmed account of what had happened, and no way for Matthew's family to reconcile their loss with a definitive narrative. And this period of stagnation illustrates a dimension of such cases that often remains less visible than the investigation or the trial. The prolonged impact of not knowing, the way in which time does not necessarily bring clarity, but instead deepens the sense of incompleteness, because without new evidence, without new leads, the case remained effectively frozen, constrained by the same limitations that had shaped the trial. The absence of a body, the lack of forensic proof, the inability to reconstruct the critical hours with certainty, and yet, within this apparent stillness, pressure continued to build, particularly from Matthew's family, whose persistence became one of the defining forces in the later stages of the case, because their efforts were not directed toward revisiting what could no longer be retried, but toward uncovering what had never been found. The physical remains that could at least provide confirmation, a place, a reality that could be acknowledged and mourned. And it is within this context that one of the most unusual and ethically complex decisions in the case emerged, a shift in strategy that reflected both the limitations of the legal system and the prioritization of truth over punishment. The decision to offer conditional immunity to Atkins, a legal mechanism that would protect him from further prosecution related to the case in exchange for information about the location of Matthew's body. And this decision represents a fundamental reorientation of purpose, because it acknowledges that the possibility of securing a conviction had effectively passed, constrained by the principle of double jeopardy and the outcome of the trial, and instead places value on recovery, on the act of finding, on providing an answer that, while not judicial, is nonetheless real. And this shift is not without controversy. It raises questions about justice, about whether the recovery of remains can or should come at the cost of relinquishing the possibility of legal accountability. But in this case, it was pursued as the only viable path forward, the only means by which the central absence could be addressed. And in 2017, this strategy led to a development that had eluded investigators for nearly a decade. Atkins directed authorities to a location within Royal National Park, a vast and difficult terrain that had been searched before without success. And there, the remains of Matthew Levison were finally discovered, an outcome that, on the surface, appears to resolve the most tangible aspect of the case, the question of where he was. But even this resolution carries its own limitations, because the condition of the remains, after so many years, did not allow for a definitive determination of the cause of death. nor did it provide a detailed reconstruction of the events that led to that death. And so, while the discovery confirmed what had long been assumed, that Matthew had died, it did not answer how or why, and it did not alter the legal status of the case. Because the immunity granted to Atkins, combined with his prior acquittal, ensured that no new charges would follow. And this outcome encapsulates the central paradox of the case: the coexistence of truth and unresolved justice, the fact that something essential has been found, while something equally essential remains beyond reach, and for Matthew's family. The recovery of his remains provided a form of closure that had been denied for years. The ability to mourn in a concrete way, to acknowledge his death not as an abstraction, but as a reality. And yet, that closure is necessarily partial, shaped by the knowledge that the full account of what happened remains incomplete, that the legal system, for all its processes and protections, was unable to produce a definitive resolution, and this duality extends beyond the individual case. It speaks to broader questions about the nature of justice, about the relationship between evidence and truth, about the ways in which legal standards, designed to protect against error, can also limit the ability to respond to situations where certainty is unattainable. And the case of Matthew Levison illustrates this tension with particular clarity, because it presents a scenario in which the available information strongly suggests that something irreversible occurred within a defined set of circumstances. And yet, the inability to demonstrate those circumstances with sufficient precision prevents the legal system from fully addressing them. And so the case remains, in a sense, open, not in a procedural way, but in a conceptual one. A reminder that there are instances where the boundaries of proof do not align with the boundaries of belief, where the questions that matter most cannot be answered in a way that satisfies both the need for truth and the requirements of law. And it is this misalignment that gives the case its enduring resonance, not simply as a mystery, but as an example of how the absence of evidence can shape outcomes as profoundly as its presence, and how, even when a body is found, even when a missing person is no longer missing in the physical sense, the deeper questions, the ones that define responsibility and meaning, can remain unresolved, existing in a space that lies somewhere between what is known and what can be proven. And that is where the story ultimately rests, not with a clear conclusion, but with a recognition of its limits, and with an understanding that, in some cases, those limits cannot be overcome. If the earlier chapters of the Matthew Levison disappearance are defined by absence, uncertainty, and the slow accumulation of unanswered questions, then what follows can be understood as something more reflective. A closing movement that does not resolve the story, but instead examines what remains after all available processes have run their course. Because in the years since the recovery of Matthew Levison from Royal National Park, the case has come to occupy a distinct place not only in public memory, but in the broader conversation about how justice systems function when confronted with incomplete evidence. And it is here that the narrative shifts from the sequence of events to their implications, for what happened to what it means. And one of the most striking aspects of this case is the way in which it illustrates the difference between resolution and closure. Because while certain questions have been answered, most notably the question of where Matthew was, others remain fundamentally unresolved, including the precise circumstances of his death and the extent to which those circumstances can be attributed to any individual in a legal sense. And this distinction is not merely semantic. It reflects a structural reality within criminal justice, the idea that truth and proof, while related, are not identical, that it is possible for something to be widely believed, even strongly supported by context, and yet remain beyond the reach of legal confirmation. And this gap between belief and proof is not a flaw in the system so much as a consequence of its design. because the standards that prevent wrongful conviction are the same standards that, in cases like this, limit the ability to secure a definitive outcome. And so the story of Matthew Levison becomes, in part, a case study in those limits. In a way that a legal framework built on evidence and procedure can encounter situations where the available information does not align neatly with the requirements for action. And this raises broader questions about how such cases are understood, both by those directly affected and by the public, because there is often an expectation that investigations lead to clear conclusions, that trials produce definitive answers, that the arc of a case moves from uncertainty to resolution. But here, that arc is disrupted. It bends toward an outcome that is simultaneously informative and incomplete. And for Matthew's family, this creates a complex form of closure, one that includes the recovery of his remains, the ability to acknowledge his death in a tangible way, but also the enduring awareness that the full story has not been, and may never be, fully articulated in a legal forum. And this duality is perhaps one of the most difficult aspects of cases like this. The coexistence of answers and unanswered questions. The sense that something essential has been achieved while something equally essential remains out of reach. And beyond the personal dimension, the case also resonates within discussions of investigative strategy, particularly the decision to offer conditional immunity to Michael Atkins, a decision that reflects a willingness to prioritize the recovery of remains over the pursuit of additional legal action. And while this strategy ultimately led to the discovery in 2017, it also underscores the trade-offs inherent in such decisions. The idea that in order to obtain one form of truth, another form of resolution may need to be relinquished, and this trade-off is not easily evaluated. It depends on perspective, on values, on the relative importance assigned to different outcomes. And in this case, it highlights the fact that justice is not a singular concept, but a collection of objectives that do not always align: the desire to punish wrongdoing, the need to establish truth, the importance of providing closure to those affected, and the recognition that achieving all of these simultaneously is not always possible. And as the case continues to be discussed and remembered, it serves as a reminder of that complexity, of the ways in which legal systems operate within constraints, of the ways in which evidence shapes possibility, and of the ways in which absence, whether in the form of missing information or missing proof, can influence outcomes as powerfully as presence. And ultimately, the story does not end with a definitive statement about what happened in those missing hours. It ends with a recognition of what cannot be fully known, and with an acknowledgement that this uncertainty is not a failure to be corrected, but a condition to be understood, a reflection of the limits of knowledge, the limits of proof, and the limits of the systems we rely on to bridge the gap between the two. And in that sense, the case of Matthew Levison remains not only a story about a single disappearance, but a broader exploration of how we confront the unknown, how we interpret incomplete narratives, and how we come to terms with outcomes that do not conform to our expectations of resolution. And it is in that space between what is known and what remains uncertain that the story continues to exist. What remains, after every timeline has been reconstructed and every legal avenue exhausted in the Matthew Levison disappearance, is not a final answer, but a quiet persistence of questions, the kind that do not fade with time, but instead settle into the background of how the case is remembered. Because even with the recovery of Matthew Levison from Royal National Park, even with the acknowledgement that he did not simply walk away from his life in Sydney, the most critical elements of the story remain beyond precise definition. And this is where the narrative shifts once more, not toward new evidence or new proceedings, but toward interpretation, toward the way in which such a case is understood when it can no longer be advanced in a traditional sense. And in that understanding, the gap between what is known and what can be proven continues to define the outcome. Because while the sequence of events has been narrowed to a specific window, the hours between 2:0 a.m. and 7:0 a.m., that window has never been filled with verifiable detail. It remains a space described rather than demonstrated. A segment of time that carries the weight of explanation without the support of independent confirmation. And it is this gap that continues to shape the way the case is perceived, not only as a mystery, but as an illustration of how absence functions within both investigation and memory. Because absence is not empty, it is structured, it has boundaries, it is defined by what surrounds it, and in this case, it is bounded by the last confirmed sighting at ARQ nightclub and the later recovery in the national park. And within those boundaries lies everything that matters and nothing that can be conclusively proven. And as a result, the case resists closure in a way that is both specific and universal. Specific in its details, in the individuals involved, in the exact sequence of known events, but universal in the questions it raises about how societies process unresolved outcomes, how legal systems balance certainty and doubt, and how individuals, particularly those closest to the case, navigate the space between partial answers and enduring uncertainty. And for the family of Matthew Levison, this navigation is not abstract, it is ongoing, shaped by the coexistence of recovery and incompleteness, by the fact that they have a place to direct their grief and yet no definitive account of the circumstances that led to that loss. And this duality underscores one of the central tensions of the case. The idea that closure is not a single moment, but a process, one that can be advanced by certain developments and limited by others. And beyond the personal dimension, the case also continues to influence broader discussions about investigative practice, particularly in relation to cases without immediate physical evidence, because it highlights the importance of early documentation, of corroboration, of the ways in which even small pieces of information can become critical when larger elements are missing. And at the same time, it reinforces the reality that not all gaps can be filled, that some cases will always contain elements that remain inaccessible, not because of a lack of effort, but because of the conditions under which they occurred. And this recognition does not diminish the significance of the investigation or the legal process, but it does reframe their outcomes, shifting the emphasis from resolution to understanding, from definitive answers to informed interpretation, and in that sense, the story of Matthew Levison continues not as an active case, but as a reference point, a way of examining how truth is constructed, how it is challenged, and how it is sometimes left incomplete. And it is within this ongoing reflection that the case finds its final form, not as a closed narrative, but as an open one, a story that remains present precisely because it does not conclude in the way we expect, and because it continues to ask questions that do not have simple answers. Questions about responsibility, about evidence, about the relationship between what happened and what can be shown to have happened, and ultimately, about the limits of certainty itself. And it is in those limits that the lasting impact of the case can be found, not in what it resolves, but in what it leaves unresolved, and in the way it invites continued consideration of the space between the two. In the end, the Matthew Levison disappearance settles into something that is neither fully resolved nor entirely unknowable, a case that exists in the uneasy space between certainty and limitation, where the outline of what happened can be traced, but the details refuse to fully emerge. And it is within this space that the story continues to resonate, not because it offers a clear conclusion, but because it challenges the expectation that every narrative must arrive at one. And at the center of that tension remains Matthew Levison, whose life, though defined in this context by its abrupt and unexplained ending, cannot be reduced to the circumstances of his disappearance alone. Because before that final night in Sydney, he existed within a network of relationships, routines, and experiences that reflected a life actively lived, a life that did not show signs of withdrawal or intention to vanish. And it is this contrast between the continuity of his life and the suddenness of its interruption that gives the case its enduring emotional weight. Because it resists narratives that rely on inevitability. It does not present a sequence that leads clearly toward its outcome, but rather a break that occurs without warning, without a visible transition, and without a complete explanation. And as the years pass, this lack of explanation does not diminish the significance of the case. It reinforces it, because it highlights the limits of reconstruction, the point at which even careful analysis cannot extend further. And this is particularly evident in the way the critical hours of that night remain defined not by what is known, but by what cannot be independently verified. The account provided by Michael Atkins exists as the only continuous narrative of that period. Yet it stands without corroboration, shaped by inconsistencies that prevent it from becoming a stable foundation for legal certainty. And this imbalance between the centrality of the account and the absence of supporting evidence is one of the defining characteristics of the case, because it creates a situation in which the most important information is also the least secure. And as a result, every attempt to draw a definitive conclusion encounters the same barrier: the inability to move from possibility to proof. And this barrier is not merely a technical issue. It reflects a deeper principle within the legal system: the requirement that conclusions be grounded in evidence that can withstand challenge, that can be examined and confirmed. And while this principle is essential for protecting against error, it also means that in cases where such evidence is unavailable, the outcome may remain unresolved. Not because the truth does not exist, but because it cannot be demonstrated in the required form. And this distinction is central to understanding why the case concludes as it does. Why the recovery of Matthews remains from Royal National Park, while significant, does not transform the legal outcome. Because the condition of those remains does not provide the additional information needed to reconstruct the events with certainty. And the legal protections already in place prevent further prosecution. And so the case reaches a point where factual knowledge and legal action diverge, where one advances slightly while the other remains fixed. And it is within this divergence that the final shape of the story emerges, not as a resolution, but as an acknowledgement of limits. And yet, within those limits, there is still meaning to be drawn, because the case illustrates, with unusual clarity, the relationship between evidence and narrative, the way in which stories are built from what can be shown, and the way in which they remain incomplete when key elements are missing. And it also underscores the importance of perspective, because for investigators, the case represents a challenge defined by constraints for the legal system. It represents the application of standards designed to ensure fairness, and for Matthew's family, it represents a loss that is only partially addressed by the answers that have been found. And these perspectives do not align perfectly. They reflect different priorities, different measures of resolution, and different ways of understanding what it means for a case to be finished. And in this sense, the story does not end with a single conclusion, but with a set of parallel understandings, each valid within its own context, each incomplete in its own way, and together, they form a narrative that is defined not by closure, but by continuity, by the ongoing presence of questions that do not have definitive answers. and by the recognition that some cases remain open, not because they're still being investigated, but because they cannot be fully resolved. And it is this recognition that gives the case of Matthew Levison its lasting impact, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a reminder of the limits of certainty, the boundaries of proof, and the enduring complexity of truth when it exists without the means to be conclusively demonstrated. As the narrative of the Matthew Levison disappearance reaches its furthest point, what remains is not a final revelation, but a quiet reckoning with the boundaries of what can be known. Because even after years of investigation, legal proceedings, and the eventual recovery of Matthew Levison from the remote expanse of Royal National Park, the case does not resolve into a single definitive account. Instead, it settles into a form shaped by fragments, by confirmed moments connected by unverified intervals. And it is within those intervals that the deepest uncertainty persists. Because the critical hours following his departure from ARQ nightclub in Sydney remain defined almost entirely by the account of Michael Atkins. An account that, while central, stands without independent confirmation and contains inconsistencies that prevent it from being fully accepted as a reliable reconstruction of events. And this creates a structural tension at the heart of the case, where the most important narrative is also the most uncertain, and as a result, every attempt to impose clarity encounters the same limitation: the absence of corroborating evidence that could transform description into demonstration. And this limitation is not merely an investigative obstacle, but a reflection of the standards that govern legal certainty. Because within the justice system, it is not enough to suspect or even to strongly believe. What matters is what can be proven through evidence that withstands scrutiny, and in this case, that threshold was never reached, not during the initial investigation, not during the 2009 trial, and not even after the later discovery of Matthew's remains. Because the condition of those remains did not allow for a determination of cause of death or a precise timeline, leaving the central questions of how and when unresolved. And this outcome illustrates a critical distinction between knowledge and proof, between the intuitive sense that a sequence of events has occurred and the formal requirement to establish that sequence in a way that can be legally recognized. And it is within this distinction that the case ultimately resides, as an example of how truth can exist in a conceptual sense while remaining inaccessible in a procedural one. And this has broader implications beyond the specifics of the case, because it highlights the inherent limitations of systems that rely on evidence, which may not always be available, particularly in situations where time, environment, or circumstance have eroded the physical traces that would otherwise provide clarity. And at the same time, it underscores the importance of those systems, because the same standards that prevent a conclusive resolution in this instance are the standards that protect against wrongful conviction in others. And this dual function, protective and restrictive, is one of the defining characteristics of modern legal frameworks. And it is brought into sharp focus by cases like this, where the cost of those protections is measured in unanswered questions, and yet, despite these limitations, the case does achieve a form of resolution, not in the legal sense, but in the restoration of Matthew's presence as more than a disappearance, because for years, his story was defined by absence, by the uncertainty of not knowing whether he was alive or dead. And the recovery of his remains changes that. It provides a point of certainty within a broader context of uncertainty. It allows his family to move from speculation to acknowledgement, from searching to remembering. And while this does not answer every question, it does alter the nature of the case, shifting it from an open-ended disappearance to a partially understood tragedy. And this shift is significant, even if it is incomplete, because it redefines what can be known and what must remain uncertain, and in doing so, It also reframes the role of those who continue to engage with the case, whether as investigators, legal professionals, or observers, because it emphasizes that not all cases conclude with clarity, that some remain defined by their gaps, and that understanding those gaps is itself a form of insight. And so the story of Matthew Levison does not end with a resolution, but with an acknowledgement of limits, of complexity, and of the enduring presence of questions that cannot be fully answered. And it is within that acknowledgement that the case finds its final expression, not as a solved mystery, but as a testament to the challenges of uncovering truth in the absence of definitive evidence, and to the enduring impact of a life that, even in its unanswered ending, continues to be remembered, examined, and understood in ways that extend beyond the confines of the case itself. In the final reflection on the Matthew Levison disappearance, what endures is not a single conclusion, but a layered understanding of how truth, justice, and memory can diverge, sometimes permanently. Because even though Matthew Levison was eventually found in Royal National Park, the recovery did not restore the missing narrative of his final hours. It did not reconstruct the exact sequence of events that unfolded after he left ARQ nightclub in Sydney. And it did not provide the kind of definitive answers that the legal system requires in order to assign responsibility with certainty. And so the case exists in a state where the physical absence has been resolved, but the explanatory absence remains. And this distinction is crucial, because it reveals how resolution can occur in one dimension while remaining incomplete in another. And it is within this duality that the lasting significance of the case can be understood, not only as an individual tragedy, but as a broader illustration of the limits inherent in both investigation and adjudication. Because the case demonstrates that even sustained effort, even years of inquiry and legal scrutiny, cannot always overcome the absence of critical evidence, and that when such evidence is missing, the outcome is shaped not only by what is known, but by what cannot be established. And this has implications that extend beyond this single case, influencing how similar cases are approached, how evidence is prioritized, and how expectations are managed when certainty proves unattainable. And at the same time, the case also highlights the human dimension that exists alongside these structural realities. Because for Matthew's family, the story is not defined by legal principles or investigative frameworks. It is defined by loss, by the passage of time without answers, and by the eventual shift from searching to mourning. A shift made possible by the recovery of his remains, but complicated by the continued absence of a complete explanation. And this complexity underscores the idea that closure is not a fixed endpoint, but a process that unfolds differently for each person involved, shaped by the information available and the questions that remain, and in this case, those questions continue to hold a central place in how the story is remembered, not as a failure of effort, but as a reflection of circumstance, of the specific conditions that limited what could be discovered and what could be proven. And this perspective allows the case to be understood not simply as unresolved, but as instructive, as a case that reveals the boundaries of certainty and the challenges of navigating those boundaries. And within this understanding, the role of Michael Atkins remains defined by that same tension, central to the narrative, yet legally unaltered by its later developments. A presence that cannot be separated from the case, but cannot be conclusively redefined within it. And this reinforces one of the most enduring aspects of the story, the idea that legal outcomes and perceived truths do not always align, that the absence of a conviction does not equate to the presence of certainty, and that the systems designed to protect fairness can also produce outcomes that feel incomplete. And yet, despite this incompleteness, the case continues to hold meaning, because it invites reflection on how justice is pursued, how truth is constructed, and how individuals and communities respond when those processes do not converge in a clear resolution. And in that sense, the story of Matthew Levison becomes more than a record of events. It becomes a point of reference, a way of examining the interplay between evidence, law, and human experience, and of recognizing that some stories remain open not because they lack significance, but because they contain complexities that cannot be fully resolved. And it is within those complexities that the case ultimately endures, not as a mystery waiting to be solved, but as a reminder of the limits of certainty and the enduring impact of a life that continues to be remembered even in the absence of complete answers. In its final consideration, the Matthew Levison disappearance does not conclude with a sense of resolution, but instead settles into a lasting presence defined by what it reveals about the fragile boundary between knowledge and proof. Because even with the recovery of Matthew Levison from the vast and remote landscape of Royal National Park, the essential narrative of his final hours remains incomplete, shaped not by a sequence of verified events, but by the absence of independent confirmation. And this absence continues to shape every interpretation of the case, reinforcing the idea that understanding is often constructed from both what is present and what is missing. And in this instance, what is missing carries as much weight as what is known, because the gap between the last confirmed sighting at ARQ nightclub in Sydney and the eventual discovery of his remains has never been fully bridged. It remains a space defined by uncertainty, where the available account, provided by Michael Atkins, exists without corroboration and therefore cannot serve as a definitive reconstruction of events. And this creates a narrative that is structurally incomplete, one in which the most critical segment cannot be independently verified, and as a result, the case resists the kind of closure that is typically associated with the end of an investigation, instead offering a more complex form of resolution, one that acknowledges both the progress that has been made and the limitations that remain. And it is within this duality that the enduring significance of the case can be understood, because it highlights the ways in which legal systems operate within constraints, relying on evidence that must meet specific standards in order to be actionable. And when those standards cannot be met, even strong suspicions cannot be translated into legal outcomes. And this principle, while essential for ensuring fairness, also means that some cases will remain unresolved in a formal sense, even when the broader context suggests a likely sequence of events. And this tension between likelihood and proof is one of the defining features of the case, shaping both its legal trajectory and its public perception, because it challenges the expectation that truth and justice will always align, demonstrating instead that they can diverge, sometimes permanently, and yet, despite this divergence, the case does achieve a form of closure, not through a verdict or a definitive explanation, but through the restoration of Matthew's presence as an individual whose life and loss are acknowledged, whose story is remembered not only for its unanswered questions, but for the context in which it unfolded. A young man embedded in a community, engaged in a life that showed no indication of disappearance. And it is this context that gives the case its enduring emotional resonance, because it underscores the abruptness of the transition from presence to absence, from a documented sequence of ordinary events to an unexplained outcome. And in reflecting on this transition, the case also invites a broader consideration of how such stories are told and remembered, how they are shaped by the available evidence, by the frameworks of investigation and law, and by the perspectives of those who continue to engage with them. And in this sense, the story of Matthew Levison extends beyond its immediate details, becoming part of a larger conversation about the nature of truth, the limits of certainty, and the ways in which unresolved cases continue to influence both individual and collective understanding. And it is within this ongoing influence that the case finds its final expression, not as a closed narrative, but as a continuing presence, a story that remains open not because it has been forgotten, but because it cannot be fully concluded, and in that openness, it continues to prompt reflection, to challenge assumptions, and to remind us that some truths, while deeply felt, may never be completely known. In its lasting echo, the Matthew Levison disappearance becomes less a question of what happened and more a reflection on what remains when certainty cannot be reached. Because even after the recovery of Matthew Levison from the quiet isolation of Royal National Park, the case continues to exist within a framework defined by partial answers, where the physical reality of his death is acknowledged, but the narrative that led to it is still fragmented. And it is within this fragmentation that the enduring power of the story lies, not in its resolution, but in its resistance to resolution. Because the critical hours following his departure from ARQ nightclub in Sydney remain beyond independent verification, shaped only by the account of Michael Atkins, an account that cannot be fully substantiated and therefore cannot serve as a definitive explanation. And this absence of confirmation does not simply leave a gap in the timeline. It transforms the way the entire case is understood, because it places uncertainty at the center rather than at the edges, making it the defining feature rather than a peripheral detail. And as a result, the case challenges conventional expectations of narrative closure, where events lead logically to conclusions, and instead presents a structure where the conclusion exists without a fully accessible path leading to it. And this inversion is what gives the case its enduring complexity, because it requires an acceptance that some aspects of truth may remain permanently out of reach, not due to a lack of effort or interest, but because of the inherent limitations of evidence and time. And in recognizing these limitations, the case also highlights the role of interpretation, the way in which individuals, whether investigators, legal professionals, or observers, construct meaning from incomplete information, drawing connections that cannot be definitively proven, but that nevertheless shape understanding. And this process of interpretation is not uniform. It varies depending on perspective, on the weight given to different elements of the case, and on the balance between skepticism and belief. And it is within this variation that the case continues to evolve, not through new evidence, but through ongoing reflection, through the ways in which it is discussed, analyzed, and remembered. And for the family of Matthew Levison, this evolution takes on a deeply personal dimension, because their understanding of the case is not confined to its legal or investigative aspects. It is intertwined with memory, with the life that preceded the disappearance, and with the effort to reconcile that life with the incomplete narrative of its end. And this reconciliation is not a single act, but an ongoing process, one that acknowledges both the answers that have been found and the questions that remain. And in this sense, the case does not move toward closure, but toward a different kind of stability, one that accepts uncertainty as a permanent element, and yet still finds ways to incorporate that uncertainty into a broader understanding. And beyond the personal sphere, the case also continues to influence how similar situations are approached, serving as a reference point for the challenges of investigating incidents where key evidence is missing, where timelines cannot be fully corroborated, and where legal constraints limit the ability to revisit conclusions. And in this way, the story extends beyond its immediate context, contributing to a larger discourse on the nature of justice, the function of evidence, and the ways in which unresolved cases are integrated into collective awareness. And ultimately, it is this integration that defines the final stage of the narrative, not as an ending, but as a continuation, a story that remains present precisely because it cannot be fully concluded, and because it continues to invite reflection on the boundaries of what can be known, what can be proven, and what must, in the end, be accepted as uncertain, and in that acceptance, the case of Matthew Levison endures, not as a mystery awaiting resolution, but as a lasting reminder of the complexity of truth and the enduring impact of its absence.